This summer, it will be 30 years since the Rio Summit of 1992. Unlike the previous decadal anniversaries, the United Nations is not organizing an event to mark the decade. Maybe it's right because the world is just about recovering from a pandemic, and the world is caught with a war in Ukraine which could disrupt the global order. When the Rio Plus 10 was organized in Johannesburg, there was a focus on looking at the evils of the globalized world. And interestingly, let me remind you, when the Rio Summit was organized in 1992, China and India were considered developing countries, and they did not have to have binding emission reduction targets. By 2012, when the Rio Plus 20 summit was organized in Rio de Janeiro again, the world order had somewhat changed. There was pressure on India and China, the building pressure on India and China to have emission reduction targets. And after the 2008 economic crisis in the developed countries, the world was talking about green economics and green job-led sustainable growth by 2012. 3 conventions came out of the Rio Summit of 1992. The Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Convention to Combat Desertification. Of these 3, the Climate Change and the Biodiversity Conventions caught international attention and also much attention in India. Interestingly, the position that India took on these 2 conventions and the trajectory that these conventions took inside the country were different. Both of them were framework conventions. That means they do require national policy or national legislation to be implemented inside the country. Right from the very beginning, internationally, India has taken a strong position on the equity issue with regards to climate change. India has insisted that it is common, but the differentiated responsibilities, that is, the developed countries have a greater share to play in mitigating climate change. Although this became reasonably insignificant after the Paris Agreement of 2015, because every country around the world had to have its own nationally determined contribution. So the earlier listing of developed countries and developing countries, the developed countries which have emission reduction targets and the developing countries which don't have emission reduction targets, that literally went out of the door with Paris. However, despite the strong position India took externally, policy action in India on climate change happened rather slowly. In 2008, it was only in 2008 when Prime Minister Manmohan Singh called for the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change, did the action really start within the country. The National Action Plan on Climate Change was initiated with its 8 missions, and within a few years, the states were encouraged to develop their state action plan on climate change. Now almost all states have their action plan on climate change. Later, The Planning Commission constituted a committee under uh, economist Deepak Parekh to uh, to look at how to drive the Indian industry into a low carbon growth path. This committee submitted its report in 2014. Still later, when the present government took charge in 2014, the National Democratic Alliance government took charge in 2014. After some initial hiccups, the government did announce its India's nationally determined contributions on October 2nd, 2015, just before the uh, Paris COP, and that talked about reducing the emission intensity of Indian economy to uh, getting more out of more energy generated out of non-fossil fuels, and three, to improve carbon sequestration through greening projects. Later, in 2019, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and even later, this last year at the Glasgow COP, the Prime Minister further enhanced the ambition on generating energy from non-fossil fuels. So it went to, by 2030, India now would generate 500 gigawatts of renewable energy, of energy from non-fossil fuels. Now, even though India has not been taking very, very strong positions, or India's India's position is not talked about in the biodiversity world internationally as much as we talk about climate change. The world, India has been in the forefront of developing a biodiversity legislation. Almost immediately after the Rio Summit in 1992, there were a series of discussions within the country which led to the development of the biodiversity legislation in 2002. India was amongst the earliest countries to develop a biodiversity legislation like this. And as a result, a National Biodiversity Authority was established in Chennai. All the states have state biodiversity boards, and there are more than 275,000 biodiversity management committees in local self-government organizations. That is the urban and the rural panchayats, the Panchayati Raj institutions. But despite the fact that the biodiversity institutions are very well established, and also biodiversity legislation came into force in India earlier than any action started on climate change, despite that, within the country, discussions on biodiversity has been less than discussions on climate change. This is true both in the media space and in the public space. There were two more events in the years 1991 and 92 that cast the influence throughout the 3 decades after that. In 1992, the national government enacted the 73rd and the 74th Amendment of the Constitution, and this gave rise to the 3-tier structure of in the districts, both by the urban route and in the rural route. So there were the Gram Sabha, the panchayats, and the Zilla Panchayat, and similar structures in the urban setup. These were further extended. The Panchayats Act was further extended to scheduled areas in 1996, that these are the areas with uh, tribal dominated population in 1996, because the amendment to the constitution did not enter into these areas. And later this led to the Forest Rights Act of 2006. So there were these three-tier structures that were created in 1992. Even though each of the states took this with different alacrity, there were state legislations by the end of 1990s. On the other hand, 1 year earlier, in 1991, economic reforms were initiated by the national government. At that time, P.V. Narasimha Rao was the Prime Minister and Dr. Manmohan Singh was the Finance Minister, and this was as a response to a balance of payment crisis. Government decided to liberalize the industrial sector through the liberalization, privatization and globalization route. The tertiary sector, that's the service sector, was in a very nascent stage at that time. So, and the growth happened later with the information technology and the information technology enabled services industries, and that also rode on the economic reforms. The economic reforms rewrote the aspirations of the country. The liberalized manufacturing and the service sector meant that there were greater amount of goods and services created for the consumption of the Indian middle class. And this led to the growth of new cities, a new tier of urban centers, more urbanization, which in its turn had its habitat destruction, and it also led to linear infrastructure passing through railway lines, new highways passing through protected areas, and it had coastal infrastructure going through the coast. Even though the implementation of the Panchayats Act varied in different states, it gave enhanced sense of power to local communities. Most of us who are following the environment developments in the country are aware of how in 2013 multiple panchayats, gram sabhas in Odisha protested and resolved against bauxite mining in the Niyamagiri hills, resulting in the project being abandoned. But what many people are not aware, that this had its precedent in 1995, when a panchayat in Goa resolved against permitting a nylon 6X manufacturing facility to be established by Thapa DuPont Limited. And this company then moved to Tamil Nadu to establish its facility. The Panchayats Act and the creation of the biodiversity management committees also gave a platform for local self-government and local communities to assess and document their own biological diversity within their areas, and this led to the documentation of people's biodiversity register in many parts of the country. So a greater awareness of local biological diversity and traditional knowledge, and these were recorded so that this could not be patented elsewhere. It also gave a platform for training institutions to work with panchayats leader like the local administration institute in Kerala to train panchayat leaders on climate change, which in turn led to uh, panchayats like the Meenangadi Panchayat in Wayanad to start the process of turning its panchayat area into a carbon neutral area. The biggest hit back on the environment in the past 30 years, however, came from nature. As we are talking, there's a severe heat wave which has gripped most parts of North India and into adjoining parts of Pakistan as well. Temperatures have been between 45 to 50 degrees, and in some locations even more than 50 degrees. And while experts have been trying to linking these heat waves to climate change, and have been asking for a national heat code, the prognosis is that these heat waves are only likely to increase in the coming years and decades. This prognosis is by the Working Group 1 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it talks of increasing heat waves of higher intensity and frequency, and this would mean that there could also be events of great rainfall across India and South Asia in the coming years. But heat waves over land is only part of the story. The other part is recent research has been showing that there have been an increase in the number of heat waves over the ocean, marine heat waves. Marine heat waves have increased by 1.5 events every year, every decade in the past 10 years over the northern Arabian Sea, and in a reasonably similar manner of 0.5 events per decade over Bay of Bengal. Now, what this means to our monsoon system and our economy, which usually every year the economic cycle starts kicking in after the first harvest, and the first monsoon is still very critical for India to start its economic cycle, is something that is that does not promise a good future. We know that the northeast monsoon, which essentially is the returning southwest monsoon, is usually a string of convectional rainfall over the Bay of Bengal, and this gives rains on the east coast and some rains which go deeper into the peninsula. But the southwest monsoon, which is the primary monsoon of the country, historically has been a more evened out monsoonal system, which has a certain reliability and progression across weeks and dates. However, with the sea surface temperature rising over the Arabian Sea, even Arabian Sea is seeing a series of convectional events, that is depressions, cyclones, etc., happening in the past few years. So southwest monsoon could become a string of extreme weather events in the coming years, which means even though parts of the country may receive the same amount of rainfall across a year, there would be periods of high rainfall and periods of no rainfall during the monsoon period, which which has which can have poor impact on agriculture and thereby the starting of the economic cycle. People's involvement have also increased, and awareness for that matter has increased in the past few years because of these extreme weather events, and people's awareness on both climate change and environment has improved because they're faced with these extreme weather events. So in December 2015, when there was floods in Chennai, surrounding areas, and the higher state government authorities were lacking in action, it is the local citizens who set up very innovative communication systems, which now literally have spread across the country, which can give literally present casting information to people to take care during extreme weather events. Similar systems were used during the Kerala floods of August 2019, which cost the state rupees 310 billion. So that was the kind of impact that Kerala floods had, and that's the kind of economic impact that floods and drought and extreme weather events in the future is likely to have. It is these developments that make India's energy transition to a non-fossil fuel based energy system a welcome move. In the global picture, when 17% of the global population moves to non-fossil fuel based energy system gradually, this certainly has impact. In the domestic system, with corporate majors both from within the country and outside having made commitments for investment on renewable energy, there is promise of this pulling through the economy, which had been battered with multiple wrong decisions and also the pandemic. There are concerns, of course, there are concerns on this transition, energy transition process, concerns that state that the energy transition process has to be made more socially and environmentally just, so that some of the mistakes that were made in the fossil fuel sector are not repeated in the renewable energy sector. But what we also see in the recent years, because of the promise of investment in the renewable energy sector, we are also seeing a change in the funding pattern for green technology. While earlier it was green diplomacy and clean development mechanism, which brought people to countries like India, to invest in countries like India, that is, developed countries to invest in countries like India. Now we are seeing more of business investments. So that is an area which has opened up some promise in the recent times. As India grows in its renewable energy capacity and its economy becomes less carbon intensive, it also has a very important spillover impact, that India becomes less dependent on fossil fuel supplies from other countries, which is fossil fuel supply from other countries transported through disruption prone shipping channels. As the Ukraine war showed how a war in a region and associated economic sanctions suddenly took out 14% of the world's crude oil, petroleum oil, uh, and also cut supplies from the world's second largest natural gas producer. And this had its and will continue to have implications on the fossil fuel scene for quite some time to come. 40% of the cargo shipped across global oceans is fossil fuel. So this is according to the UNCTAD's, the United Nations UNCTAD's review of marine transport uh, in the year 2021. Of this, the most significant portion is transported to countries in Asia, leading the pack, China, India, etc. This includes both fossil fuels, petroleum products, and also coal. Last year, China imported 20% of the global coal traded, and India was not very far behind. India imported 19% of the world trade, according to UNCTAD's review of marine transport 2021. Reduction in marine transport has another significant impact. This is, if there is reduction in the number of ships traversing the global oceans, that would mean there would be a reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions, because 2% of the global greenhouse gas emissions is from the shipping industry. So there could be a reduction in that, and there could be a reduction in marine pollution, because ships, spill out oil, bilge water, etc. There could be reduction in air pollution, and also reduction in biodiversity loss because of these shipping channels, and cause biodiversity loss due to killing of sea animals during the transport. The final analysis, despite the earth becoming warmer, more prone to extreme weather events, and having lost biodiversity since the time the two conventions were designed 30 years ago to prevent climate change and also to conserve biodiversity. Despite the fact that these huge changes have been in the negative globally, there has also been some positive changes, with countries moving, and big consuming countries transitioning to from fossil fuels to non-fossil fuels, renewable energy. And this perhaps is the hope that we can see at the end of this 30-year period and the beginning of the remaining decades.